Hey folks, tonight we're heading somewhere loud, sweaty and full of yelling. Ancient Sparta. You've seen the movies, you've heard the war cries. But living there? Yeah, not quite a slow-mo action scene. More like boot camp forever. Think you've got what it takes to survive a day among the toughest warriors in history? Spoiler alert, you don't. But before we get screamed at by a man in a red cloak, feel free to like the video and subscribe. Only if you enjoy history with a hint of trauma. And drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. Now grab your cloak, flex for no reason, and let's march straight into the chaos that was Sparta. You wake up face first in straw. Not a cozy mattress, not even a sad pillow. Just hay, and maybe a few bugs. The wooden floor is cold, your tunic smells like goat, and your back feels like it just wrestled a bear. Spoiler, it didn't. You're just 14, and the Spartan state already considers you state property. Congratulations. The sun isn't even up yet, but your paidonomos, aka child-beating instructor, kicks the door open like a tax collector with a grudge. Time to start your mandatory morning. There is no sleep in. There is no 5 more minutes. There is only run until your feet bleed and try not to die. You're not a boy? Oh, don't relax yet. If you're a Spartan girl, you're not learning embroidery, you're getting jacked. You do gymnastics, you throw javelins, you might even wrestle. Because in Sparta, everyone trains for war. Gender equality here just means everyone suffers equally. You shuffle out to the training grounds with a bunch of other sleep-deprived 12-year-olds. The air is cold, the sand is rough, and you haven't eaten. That's not a mistake. That's the curriculum. Starving is part of the training. If you want food, you steal it. And if you get caught, they don't punish you for stealing. They punish you for being bad at it. You spar until you can't feel your arms. You run until your legs give out. Then someone older, like a terrifying 17-year-old, beats you with a stick because it builds character. If your rib doesn't snap today, it probably will tomorrow. And that's the agoge, baby. The official Spartan childhood experience. Somewhere between extreme boot camp and child gladiator school. Lunch time. And by lunch, we mean a wooden bowl of black broth. What's black broth, you ask? Picture this. Pig's blood, boiled with vinegar and salt until it looks like engine oil and smells like roadkill stew. Even other Greeks thought it was vile, but Spartans loved it because pain is delicious. There's also barley bread, but don't expect butter, or jam, or even heat, and don't you dare complain. Whining is weakness, and weakness is a one-way ticket to being left in a ditch. Think you'll make friends and laugh around a fire after dinner? Nope. Your social life consists of sitting around in silence with a bunch of other exhausted boys in various stages of bruising. You don't even bathe daily. Spartans thought too much cleanliness made you soft, and hair care. The only part they cared about was growing it long before battle, so you looked intimidating, right before stabbing people in the face. If you survive your teens without dying of infection or trauma, congrats, you're a Spartan adult. Now pick up your hoplon, that's a 15-pound bronze shield, and get ready for war. Every adult male Spartan is a full-time soldier until age 60. That's not a poetic exaggeration. It's a legal requirement, and war isn't a rare event, it's a lifestyle. Sparta isn't defending itself, it's always attacking someone, whether it's Athens, Persia, or just some poor village with olive trees. And if you die in battle, that's the dream. You get your name remembered, you get the glory, you get the burial with honours. But if you run away, you're dead to everyone. Your name is scratched out, your family disowns you, your mom spits on the ground when she hears your name. Let's be clear, Spartan society didn't care about your personality, or your dreams, or your childhood trauma. It cared about obedience. You don't get a sense of self in Sparta. You get a permanent seat on the do what you're told or get whipped train. From the moment you could walk, you're taught to shut up, follow orders and take a beating like it's applause. Talk back to your elders, that's a lashing. Move too slowly, that's another lashing. Cry during the lashing, triple lashing. Oh, and your elders aren't just old men in tunics. They're 30-year-old war veterans who've probably killed more people than they've spoken words that day. Their idea of parenting, turning you into a perfect, unthinking warbot. Emotions are for Athenians and corpses. And speaking of pain for fun, let's talk about the ritual beatings. Yes, Spartans had a religious festival, Diamastagosis, where teenage boys would get whipped in public. Not for punishment, for sport, for the gods. The goal was to not cry out, or pass out, or die. Though dying sometimes happened, and the crowd would still cheer. Because what better way to prove your Spartan material than bleeding out to applause? Now let's say you're doing really well in training. You're quiet, deadly, and just sociopathic enough to earn the government's attention. Congrats. You've been selected for the Cryptia, basically Spartan Hunger Games. You're handed a knife and told to go out into the countryside to murder enslaved helots in the dark. No, seriously, that was the mission. These teenage death squads were sent to instill fear, kill the strongest helots, Sparta's enslaved class, and prove your ability to kill without mercy. No trial, no reason, just knife practice on human beings. If you're thinking, that sounds like a psychotic death cult, correct? But in Sparta, it was a resume booster. You thought maybe things were easier for women. Surprise. Spartan women weren't baking pies. They were doing squats, throwing discus, and mocking the weak. They were raised to be tough, loud, and fearless because their job was to produce warrior sons. And if their sons ever ran from battle, Spartan mums were fierce enough to kill them themselves. The phrase, "come back with your shield or on it," wasn't metaphorical. It was your mother saying, "win or die, no in between." Romance in Sparta, let's just say it had a different vibe. Men didn't even live with their wives until they were around 30. Even then, it was usually sneaking around between training sessions. Marriage was more of a government-mandated breeding program than a love story. And emotional expression, that's Athenian nonsense. And if you were a boy, chances are you were expected to have a mentor. And by mentor, we mean an older Spartan man who teaches you the art of war, and maybe a lot more. Spartan culture was steeped in institutionalized relationships between older and younger warriors, because emotional bonds, they believed, made you fight harder in war. Romanticized? Maybe. Complicated? Definitely. Comfortable? Absolutely not. Ah, the helots. Sparta's enslaved majority. There were 7 of them for every Spartan. That's right. Sparta was a military superpower built on the backs of people they brutalized and oppressed daily. The helots farmed your food, built your homes, died without names, and every Spartan was trained from childhood to see them not as humans, but as a threat. That's why the Spartan army was always mobilized, not to conquer, to keep the helots in line. They were allowed to marry, have families, but they were also randomly executed, humiliated, and forced to wear dogskin hats, just to remind them they were less than nothing. If you think being a Spartan was awful, being under the Spartans was a nightmare on a whole new level. Scene 11. Religion and superstition. Now, if you were hoping for a little divine guidance, good luck. The Spartans worshipped the same gods as other Greeks, but with way more knives and blood. Their temples were warlike. Their rituals involved sacrifices and omens. Before any battle, they wouldn't even march until the signs were right, because if Zeus sneezed wrong, that meant maybe you shouldn't invade Athens today. And festivals, instead of fun or feasting, many involved pain endurance or proving how long you could fast or suffer in silence. Party hard, Sparta style. So, you're still here? Still breathing? Let's ruin that with a proper look at one thing Sparta did best. Training you into a weapon, or breaking you trying. From the time you were 7 years old, you belonged to the agoge. That's not a school. That's a state-sponsored trauma factory where childhood goes to die. You don't get toys, you get a single cloak, year-round. Doesn't matter if it's boiling, freezing or raining. No shoes either. The state's logic? If you're cold and miserable now, you'll be harder to kill later. You learn to fight, steal, and kill. In fact, you're encouraged to steal. But if you get caught, you're not punished for stealing. You're punished for getting caught. So now you're hungry, bruised, and learning stealth like your life depends on it. Because it does. Meals, boiled pig's blood soup with barley. No seasoning, no second servings. It's not a treat, it's a test. You leave dinner just as hungry as when you arrived. And if you complain, that's a beating. If you don't complain, they might beat you anyway, just to check if you're going soft. Your daily schedule is basically pain. You wake up to a barked command, not the sun. You run, wrestle, stab dummies, stab each other, clean your wounds with cold water, and repeat. The only time you get a break is when an older boy uses you for target practice. Then it's more running, more drills, more shouting. The only reward is surviving long enough to do it again tomorrow. There's no privacy. You sleep on reeds you had to rip out of a river with your bare hands. If you didn't get enough, too bad. You sleep on dirt. If someone steals your blanket, you better steal it back or freeze. Crying is a luxury. Your tears are considered a tactical disadvantage. Older boys are encouraged to bully you. The instructors expect them to toughen you up with verbal abuse and physical beatdowns. If they go too far, well, maybe you weren't Spartan enough. One less problem for the state. Instructors don't lecture you. They beat lessons into you. They believe pain burns knowledge into the bones. You learn to march in silence. You learn to fight without flinching. You learn to obey the second a command is given, without thinking, without questioning, and absolutely without hesitation. By your teens, if you're still alive, your mind doesn't work like a normal human's. You don't think about what you want. You think about what the state wants, and the state wants one thing: a killer who can function in a blizzard on an empty stomach with a knife wound and no complaints. That's not resilience. That's manufactured psychosis. You become the perfect tool, sharp, silent, deadly, and disposable. And that's if you're one of the lucky ones. The unlucky ones, they're bones beneath the training grounds. No names, no ceremony, just a lesson for the next kid not to fail. So, still think you'd make it through a day in ancient Sparta? This was just training. Now imagine this. You've survived the Agauge. You've been starved, beaten, frozen, humiliated, turned into a weapon. And guess what? That was the easy part, because now it's war. You're 20. You've earned your red cloak, your round shield, your bronze helmet. You get a short sword, not for glory, but for stabbing people up close, in the face, under the ribs, wherever it goes in easiest. You also get a 6-foot spear. You don't throw it. You hold the damn thing like your life depends on it, because it does. The sun hasn't risen yet, but your unit's already lined up in formation. A phalanx, tight, shoulder to shoulder, shields locked. You're not a guy in an army. You are the army. One unit, one breath. If one of you stumbles, you all die. Marching toward the enemy is like walking into a meat grinder. You smell sweat, blood, and unwashed armour. The battlefield isn't glorious. It's a muddy patch of trampled earth, with a chorus of nervous farts and whispered prayers. Then the horns blow, and it's go time. Your heart is racing, but your feet stay in formation. You raise your shield, you lower your spear, you scream, because everyone else is screaming, and if you don't, it feels like your lungs might explode from the pressure. And then you crash into the enemy like a human bulldozer made of bronze and hate. The first row stabs, the second row supports, the third pushes. Is not elegant, it's not cinematic, it's a pile of flesh, bones, splinters and screams. You don't swing your sword, you jam it. You don't parry, you bash. You aim for necks, thighs, groins, anything soft enough to bleed. There are no breaks, no calling time out. You fight until the enemy breaks, you break, or the gods decide they're bored. And when someone falls in your line, you don't stop, you don't help. You step over their body and keep pushing forward. Compassion is weakness. Hesitation is death. You don't count kills. You count who's still standing next to you. And every second, fewer are. If you survive, and that's a massive if, you don't go home a hero. You go back to camp and clean your gear with sand and spit. You sleep on the ground. You eat dry barley again. You stitch up your own wounds or let the flies do it. And no one thanks you, not even your commander, because war is what you're for. It's not an accomplishment. It's your damn duty. So the next time you picture being a badass Spartan warrior charging into battle, ask yourself this. Can you stand in a blood-soaked field, ankle deep in guts, holding the line while your best friend screams behind you with a spear through his face and not even look back? No? Then congratulations. You wouldn't last a day in Sparta. Family life. Sounds wholesome, right? Wrong. You don't get a cozy home with mum and dad teaching you how to ride a bike. In Sparta, your family is more like a breeding contract in a boarding school that never ends. Love? That's for poets and weaklings. If you're born a boy, the moment you cry your first cry, someone's already judging whether you're worth keeping alive. A council of elders inspects your newborn body like a piece of meat. Got a deformity? Too small? Too sickly? They don't wait to see if you'll grow out of it. They toss you off a cliff, literally, down into a ravine called Apothete. Because Sparta doesn't invest in defective warriors. If you pass the test, congrats. You stay alive. But you don't get much of a childhood. At 7, you're torn away from your family and shoved into the Agog, Sparta's state-run boot camp for boys. Your parents don't fight it. They expect it. It's an honour. From that point on, your instructors are your new parents. And their love language? Beatings, starvation, and psychological warfare. See your mother? Maybe on a festival day. Hug her? Dream on. She's not supposed to coddle you anyway. Her job was to raise a future killer, not a soft-hearted mama's boy. And marriage? Don't expect romance. You don't even live with your wife after the wedding. Nope. Married Spartans sleep in the barracks with their military unit. If you want to visit your wife, you sneak out at night like a teenage delinquent, hope the guards don't catch you, and sneak back before sunrise. Some men go years without spending a full night at home. As for Spartan women, yeah, they had more rights than most ancient cultures. They could own land, inherit wealth, and talk smack to men in public. But don't confuse that for luxury. Their job was just as brutal. Make strong babies. If they couldn't. Useless. If they gave birth to weaklings. Shame. Their value wasn't in what they did. It was in what they could produce. And guess what? There was no privacy. No secrets. Everyone knew everyone's business. Your life, your body, your family. They belonged to Sparta. So no, you wouldn't be tucking your kids in at night. You wouldn't be baking bread with your spouse or playing with your dog in the yard. You'd be raising a soldier, or being one, and you'd better be good at it. Because in Sparta, family life wasn't about love, it was about legacy. And if you couldn't carry yours in a shield, you were better off not being born at all. You hungry? Good. That's how a Spartan's supposed to feel. Let's get one thing straight. Spartan cuisine wasn't about flavour, it wasn't about comfort. It wasn't even really about nutrition. It was about toughness, mind over stomach. You didn't eat to enjoy yourself. You ate so you wouldn't die during the next round of beatings. The main dish? Black broth. Sounds mysterious, right? It's not. It's a mix of pig's blood, vinegar and boiled pork. That's it. Imagine sipping on something that looks and tastes like it was scraped from the bottom of a battlefield. Foreigners gagged at the smell alone. One guy from Athens said you had to lose your sense of taste to stomach it. Spartans? They called it dinner. Some even dipped stale bread into it to soak up the blood like it was olive oil. Bon appétit. And don't think you're getting seconds. You get one serving. That's it. Meals were regulated and served in military mess halls, not your cosy little kitchen. No mom piling food on your plate. No secret snacks stashed under the bed. You ate with your Sicilia, your military unit, and if you couldn't contribute food or supplies to the group, they kicked you out. No handouts, no excuses. If you were still training in the Agol, things were even worse. They deliberately starved you. Why? Because hunger makes you cunning. They wanted you to steal food. just not get caught. If you did get caught, you got flogged, not for stealing, for failing. So you learn fast. You want to eat, be clever, be quiet, and don't look guilty. Meat was rare. Fish? Only if you lived near water and got lucky. Fruit? Seasonal? And bread? It's there, but it's hard and dry and mostly just a vehicle for getting that black sludge into your mouth without throwing up. There were no feasts, no sweets, no comfort food, no sitting around a fire telling stories with a bowl of stew. The only thing on your plate was the minimum required to keep you useful to Sparta. Anything more was weakness. So yeah, good luck complaining about cafeteria food again after that. Feeling bored? Not in Sparta. There's no room for boredom when every moment of your life is either preparation for war or a reminder that you're not tough enough yet. You want to play music? Cool. Hope you like flutes. That's pretty much your only option. And you don't play it to relax or impress someone on a date. You play it to keep time during military drills or to accompany marching. That's right. Music wasn't art here, it was strategy. Rhythm helped keep the phalanx tight. One beat off, and you're dead. Play it wrong, and someone else is. Dancing? Sure, but forget about graceful twirls at festivals. Spartan dancing looked more like synchronized combat with a beat. Every move served a purpose: strength, balance, control. It was like ballet if the choreographer was a war general with a grudge. Storytelling. Yeah, there were stories. But these weren't the kind that warmed your heart around a campfire. They were brutal legends. Tales of warriors who died with a smile, kids who killed wolves with their bare hands, kings who threw themselves into enemy lines just to prove a point. Morality tales. But only if your moral compass points directly to carnage. You're thinking about sports? Good, because that was the closest thing to fun you'd get. But don't picture a game of tag in the courtyard. Try wrestling with no rules, no weight classes, and no referees. Break a nose? Fine. Knock out some teeth? Encouraged. These games were designed to toughen you up. If you could walk away from them, you weren't trying hard enough. Then there was endurance training. Some kids were made to run barefoot over thorny ground, or stand in freezing rivers to test their willpower. And this wasn't punishment. It was the scheduled activity after breakfast. You weren't competing for prizes, you were competing to not be humiliated, or worse, called weak. Theatre? Don't make them laugh. Spartans weren't into drama, unless it ended with someone stabbing someone else in the face. They saw Athenian theatre as soft, indulgent nonsense. Emotions, public crying. You'd get mocked until you cried harder, privately, in a ditch. Oh, and festivals? Yes, they had some. But again, think less day off, and more, let's celebrate our god by whipping boys until they pass out. That was the festival of Artemis Orthia. People gathered in stadiums to watch teenagers get flogged. Some died, and the crowd cheered louder. So, yeah, if your idea of entertainment is winding down with a good book, strumming a lute, or laughing with friends over wine, you're in the wrong city. In Sparta, fun was a test. If it didn't hurt a little, it wasn't worth doing. Feeling tired? Not in Sparta. Sleep wasn't a luxury. It was a battlefield tactic. You didn't curl up in soft beds or nap through the afternoon sun. No, Spartans learned to rest lightly, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. A quick shut-eye between drills, maybe under the harsh glare of the morning sun, and then back to training. Comfort was weakness. Comfy was for losers. Hunger. Always there, lurking. Food wasn't about flavour or fullness. It was fuel for war. The infamous black broth. Yeah, that nasty mix of pork, blood, vinegar and salt. Everyone hated it, but no one complained. You ate it because it reminded you. Sparta didn't pamper, it toughened you. If you couldn't stomach the broth, how could you stomach the battlefield? Food was punishment, nourishment, and a test all in one bitter sip. And family, forget about sweet lullabies or soft hands. Spartan mothers handed their sons over like warriors to be forged, not babies to be cuddled. Come back with your shield, or on it. wasn't just a saying, it was a promise, a demand, a creed. Love was tough love, and it came with a warning. Cry in front of others? Shame. Show fear. Death to your honour. The only tears allowed were in private, and even then they had to be fast and few. Education? Not just letters and numbers. From childhood, boys entered the agog, the brutal training system designed to crush weakness and build unbreakable soldiers. They learned to fight, yes, but also to steal. Stealing wasn't a crime, it was a skill test. But get caught? Punishment wasn't a slap on the wrist, it was a lesson in pain. The goal wasn't just survival, but cunning, resourcefulness, and the ability to endure suffering with a grim smile. Girls? They weren't pampered princesses either. Spartan women were raised strong, healthy, and tough. Their job was to birth warriors and keep the household running while men were at war. They exercised hard too, running, wrestling, even boxing. They had rights, unlike most Greek women, but those rights were forged in the furnace of Spartan discipline. Marriage was about producing strong children, not candlelit dinners or poetry readings. Spartan women were as much a part of the war machine as the men. Religion? Yeah, they believed in gods, but worship was serious business, not party time. Offerings and sacrifices were brutal, blood was the currency. Festivals? As brutal as the rest of Spartan life, often involving trials of endurance or pain that would make a modern-day daredevil cringe. The gods weren't gentle, and neither were the rituals. Devotion was shown in sweat, tears, and sometimes blood. Social life? Don't expect leisurely chats or philosophical debates. Spartans communicated in grunts, shouts, and commands. Wit and cleverness were weapons, sure, but humour, that was dry, sharp, and often cutting down anyone who looked soft. They valued silence and brevity. Talking too much was seen as weak or foolish. Actions spoke louder than words, and silence could kill. Enemies. You didn't just fight them, you lived for them. Every day was a preparation for war. Spartans didn't fear death, they embraced it as the ultimate glory. Cowards were despised, and mercy was a joke. If you survived battle, you had the honour of returning home. If you didn't, your memory was celebrated, your sacrifice carved into the heart of Sparta forever. So yeah, if your idea of life is comfort, leisure, or gentle kindness, you die quickly here. Sparta was a city where the soft were weeded out, and only the strong thrived. It wasn't a place for the faint-hearted or the easily bored. Every breath, every moment was a test, a challenge to be better, tougher, deadlier. Because in Sparta, weakness wasn't just frowned upon, it was obliterated. And that, my friend, is why Spartans are still remembered. Not for their parties, their art, or their music, but for their relentless, unforgiving, unbreakable spirit. Spartans didn't mess around. Their entire society was built around one brutal goal: producing warriors. From the moment a Spartan boy was born, his fate was sealed by a cold, official inspection. If the elders deemed him weak or sickly, he was left to die, abandoned on a mountainside to the elements. Survival of the fittest wasn't just a phrase, it was the law of life. Once a boy survived that grim first test, he was taken from his family at age 7 and thrown into the Agog, the state-run military training system that was basically a lifelong boot camp. Forget school supplies. These kids got beaten, starved, and forced to endure every kind of hardship imaginable. They learned to fight, yes, but more importantly to suffer without complaining. Pain was the currency of respect. Crying was weakness. Only the toughest made it through. Food was scarce on purpose. The Spartans believed hunger sharpened your mind and hardened your body. These boys were sometimes given barely enough to eat, so they'd learn to steal from local farms and get away with it. But getting caught? That meant brutal punishments, like lashings, or worse. It was all about teaching stealth, cunning, and endurance, survival skills for real warriors. Spartan society was rigid and brutally hierarchical. The Spartiates, full citizens and professional soldiers, had the most rights, but even they lived under constant pressure. They trained daily, ate in communal mess halls, and were expected to be ready for war at a moment's notice. They were supported by a large population of helots, enslaved people who worked the land and did the menial tasks. The helots vastly outnumbered the Spartans and lived in fear because the Spartans kept them under strict control, often through terror. Annual declarations of war on the helots were made so Spartans could legally kill any suspected troublemakers. Women in Sparta were something else entirely. Unlike most Greek women who were confined indoors, Spartan women were trained to be physically strong. They exercised, ran, and even competed in athletic contests. The idea was simple. Strong mothers produced strong babies. They managed the estates while men were off fighting and had more social freedom than other Greek women, but their lives were still about supporting the militaristic state. Marriage was not about romance. Spartan couples barely saw each other, as men spent most of their time in barracks. Men married late, around 30, and their primary goal was to father healthy, strong children. The state had a vested interest in population control and eugenics. Weak or deformed babies were sometimes abandoned or left to die. Spartan government was an odd mix of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. 2 kings ruled simultaneously, mainly leading armies in war, while a council of elders and elected officials handled domestic affairs. But ultimate power was about military strength, and personal freedom was tightly restricted. Every Spartiate's life was under constant surveillance by the state to ensure loyalty and discipline. On the battlefield, Spartans were the stuff of legends because of their discipline and formation. The phalanx. This wasn't just a tactic, it was a mobile wall of shields and spears where every soldier's survival depended on perfect coordination. Breaking formation was death. This extreme discipline turned a relatively small army into an unbeatable force for decades. But it wasn't just about fighting skill. Spartans also lived with the constant shadow of death. War wasn't a rare event. It was the backbone of their entire culture. Their education, their laws, their festivals, all revolved around preparing for or glorifying war. This mindset created a society that was harsh, ruthless, and unyielding. And make no mistake, Sparta's reputation wasn't built on kindness or glory for its own sake. It was a brutal, efficient machine designed to crush enemies and maintain control over a population that outnumbered them by tens of thousands. Spartans didn't conquer through numbers. They conquered through sheer force of will, discipline, and a culture that made war their religion. So yes, Sparta wasn't a playground or a home. It was a forge where men were hammered into weapons, women into breeders of warriors, and everyone into parts of a relentless war machine. And maybe that's why, centuries later, we still tell their stories, because they remind us what happens when a society puts strength, discipline, and sacrifice above all else. The agogia, childhood in a meat grinder. The agoge wasn't school, it was state-sanctioned trauma training. From age 7, Spartan boys were stripped from their families and thrown into a world where pain was a lesson and fear was a weakness to be crushed. They slept on reeds, often without blankets. Their clothes, a single cloak for the whole year. Winter or summer, rain or wind. They endured it. Because in Sparta, comfort was a threat to discipline. They were trained in silence, obedience, and pain tolerance. Speaking out of turn, punished. Not answering quickly enough, punished. Not showing enough aggression, definitely punished. And not just by adults. Older boys were given the right to beat younger ones. It wasn't bullying, it was policy. You learned fast or you bled often. And then there was the Cryptia, a secret police force made of elite Spartan youths sent out to spy on, harass and murder helots under cover of darkness. No joke, it was seen as the final exam of the agoge. If you got chosen, you were sent into the countryside alone, unarmed, and expected to live off the land while carrying out state-sanctioned killings. It was both a rite of passage and a brutal way to keep the enslaved population in check through fear. The Helots, the broken backbone of Sparta. The Spartan system couldn't function without the Helots. These weren't just slaves. They were entire conquered populations forced into servitude. They worked the land, did the hard labour, fed the army, and they lived under permanent threat. Spartan citizens could kill Helots without trial, just for being too confident, too strong, or too visible. The Helots outnumbered Spartans by as much as 7-1, and Sparta knew it. That's why they ruled with terror. Every year the Spartan state declared war on the Helot class, officially. That way, killing one wasn't murder. It was a patriotic duty. Some Helots tried to rebel. Most were crushed. Others were forced to wear humiliating clothing, sing degrading songs, and live under constant humiliation. Imagine being forced to praise your oppressor publicly every day. That's what they lived with. Women. Tough, respected, but not free. Compared to the rest of ancient Greece, Spartan women had it good. But good in Sparta still meant hard. Girls weren't sent to the agorge, but they were expected to be physically fit, sharp-tongued and mentally strong. They trained in athletics, were taught to speak boldly, and often owned land, a rarity in the ancient world. But freedom? Not really. Their primary purpose was to produce strong sons. If a woman had 3 or more sons die in battle, she could be honoured with a gravestone. Otherwise, no recognition, no memorial. Her worth was measured by the warriors she brought into the world. Marriage wasn't built on romance. The ceremony was basically an abduction. A woman's head would be shaved, she'd be dressed in men's clothing, and the groom would sneak in at night to consummate the marriage, then sneak back to his barracks. The goal was reproduction, not intimacy. Husbands and wives rarely lived together until the man turned 30. The Spartan government. 2 kings, 0 fun. Most ancient city-states had 1 leader or an assembly. Sparta? They had 2 kings. Why? So no one got too powerful, and so one could always lead the army while the other stayed home. These kings weren't gods or emperors. They were more like generals for life, and their power was balanced by a council of elders, Gerousia, and 5 annually elected officials, ephors, who kept everyone in check, including the kings. You could be a decorated war hero and still be put on trial if you stepped out of line. This wasn't a dictatorship. It was a paranoid, heavily regimented oligarchy with just enough democratic flavour to keep it from imploding. Loyalty to the state was absolute. The individual didn't matter. Your family didn't matter. Only Sparta mattered. The phalanx. Where discipline was deadlier than the sword. The Spartan military machine was built on the phalanx, a wall of shields, spears bristling outward, moving as one. It was less like a group of men and more like a single armoured beast. Every man's shield protected the one next to him. That's why dropping your shield was the ultimate shame. It meant you betrayed your brothers. Lose your sword, fine. Lose your spear, fine. Lose your shield? Dishonour. Training for this formation started in childhood. It wasn't about individual strength. It was about timing, precision, and nerve. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with 300 men, marching in lockstep toward an enemy, knowing that one wrong move could get you and everyone beside you killed. That's what they practiced. That's what they lived for. They weren't the biggest army, but they were the most feared. Sparta. The Complete History. Part 1. Born in Blood and Legend. Before Sparta was a war machine, before boys were beaten for fun and festivals meant blood on the altar, there was just land. Laconia. Rugged, dry, mountainous. The kind of place that doesn't give you anything for free. Not food, not safety, not comfort. And maybe that's where it all began. You live in a harsh place. You become harsh people. The early Spartans weren't born out of peace. They were born out of war, like most Greek cities really. But Sparta didn't evolve into a democracy or a trade hub like Athens or Corinth. Sparta doubled down on violence, and it all starts with myth. According to legend, Sparta was founded by a descendant of Heracles. Yes, that Heracles. His name? Eurysthenes. Or was it Procles? Depends on which version you read, because Sparta didn't just have one king, it had two. Always. From the beginning, Sparta ran with dual kingship, a weird setup even by ancient standards. One king went to war, the other stayed home. Checks and balances, sure, but also two power centres, two lines of royal blood, two dynasties side by side with one job: keep the city alive and the enemies dead. Now, let's step out of legend and into what we actually know. By the 10th century BCE, Sparta was just another Dorian settlement in the Peloponnese, one of many little Greek tribes scratching out a living. But something changed. Sparta started conquering its neighbours, not for glory, not for treasure, for land. And they didn't enslave people the way the rest of the ancient world did. Number, the Spartans invented a new kind of servitude. They created the Helots, a permanently enslaved underclass, locals from conquered regions, mostly from nearby Messenia. Whole cities turned into forced labour camps. The Helots outnumbered the Spartans by 7-1, which meant one thing: fear had to be constant, control had to be total. So while other cities were building walls, Sparta built warriors. No wall around the city, that was the policy. If your people are the wall, you don't need stone, and that's where Lycurgus enters the scene. A name you're going to hear a lot. Whether he was real or just a myth wrapped in a law code, no one knows for sure. But what matters is what he left behind. The brutal blueprint of Spartan society. The agoge, the syssitia, the obsession with sameness, the hatred of wealth, comfort and softness. This wasn't democracy. It wasn't monarchy. It wasn't tyranny. It was something else. A war state. A machine. Sparta. The complete history. Part 2. How to build a killer from age 7. Welcome back to Sparta. Population. Terrified. And not just the helots. Children. The citizens. Even the kings. Because no one was safe. Not from failure. Not from judgment. And definitely not from the system. To understand what made Sparta different, what made it feared, you have to look at where it all started. Not the battlefield, the nursery. Because in Sparta, your life didn't belong to you. It belonged to the state, from birth. The infant checkpoint. Pass or die, you're born. Screaming, blinking, still slick with blood. But before you're even given to your mother, you're taken. You're brought before a council of elders. They inspect you like livestock. Your limbs, your back, your jaw. They don't care if you're cute. They care if you're strong, healthy. You live, deformed, sickly, weak. You're left at the base of Mount Taygetus to die. This wasn't cruelty. This was policy. The state didn't want compassion. It wanted efficiency. And weakness was a resource they refused to spend. Age 7, the agoge begins. 7 years old. That's when childhood ends. Your name still exists, but it doesn't matter. You're no longer a boy. You're a unit in training. You're stripped from your home, from your mother, from anything that felt safe or warm. You're marched into communal barracks, where you'll live, eat, train, and sleep with other boys, until adulthood. If you survive. The agoge wasn't a school. It was psychological warfare disguised as education. Reading, writing, barely. Just enough to follow orders and deliver commands. The real curriculum? Pain, hunger, endurance, control. Lessons in hunger and violence. You're fed just enough to survive. Never enough to be full. If you want more, you steal. But if you get caught, you're beaten. Not for stealing, but for failing to do it properly. See the lesson? It's not about morality. It's about skill. Learn to be cunning. Learn to be silent. Learn to hide pain. Even when your skin breaks and your bones bruise, don't cry. Pain was a tool, and silence was power. You were expected to fight other boys, not for fun, for hierarchy, for dominance. You wrestled without rules, you boxed with fists, teeth, knees. You could bleed, break a bone, knock someone unconscious. There were no referees, only judgment. If you lost, you trained harder. If you won, you'd better win again tomorrow. The Crypthea, teenage assassins. Think the Agurg was just drills and fists? Think again. Around age 18, the most promising boys were given a final test. They joined the Crypthea, a secret police unit that operated at night. Their mission: terrorise the Helots. They were sent into the countryside, armed with knives, dressed in black. They hid during the day. At night they emerged. They killed any Helot who looked strong, anyone who might lead a revolt, anyone who was too proud. No trial, no arrest, just execution by teenagers. It was training, but also it was population control. The Helots were many, the Spartans were few, so they ruled with fear. And who better to deliver that fear than boys fresh out of a decade of dehumanization? The Crypthea wasn't just a secret rite of passage, it was the soul of Sparta, a reminder that citizenship came with blood on your hands. The Syssitia, brotherhood by force by adulthood, around age 20. You weren't finished. You still didn't live at home. You were now assigned to a Syssitian, a military mess group. About 15 men. These were your comrades, your brothers. You ate every meal with them, trained with them, fought beside them, and you didn't choose them. You earned your place. You had to be voted in unanimously. If just one man blackballed you, you were out. Forever. No secession, no meals, no political rights, no status. You'd trained for 13 years and still weren't good enough. In Sparta, even belonging was a weapon you had to fight for. Spartan women, the strangest power in Greece. While the boys were broken and rebuilt into soldiers, the girls were doing something radically different. They were training too. Running, wrestling, throwing javelins. Not because they go to war, but because they give birth to warriors. Strong women made strong babies, the logic went. Spartan women weren't confined like in Athens. They spoke boldly, managed land, even insulted men publicly if they showed weakness. But make no mistake, their power was conditional. Their entire purpose was to reproduce. And failure in that realm was failure as a citizen. One woman reportedly watched her son flee battle and said, "Why did you come back? You should have died." That's the kind of mother Sparta made. The final transformation. By age 30, if you survived everything, agoge, crypthea, battles, evaluations, you became a full citizen, a Spartiate. You could vote, own land, marry, and yet you still lived mostly in the barracks, still trained every day, still served the state above all. You weren't free, you were never free, you were Spartan, and the system had worked. It had forged the most disciplined, terrifying, unified military in the Greek world. They didn't build empires, they didn't write philosophies, they built warriors, and every single one of them started out as a terrified child who learned to stop crying. They had trained for centuries, forged from birth, bred to kill, bred to obey. But Sparta, for all its brutality, had mostly kept to itself. No empire, no expansion, just control, just the system, the fear, the machine. Then came Persia, not just an army, an empire, a world-eater, towering like a god across the east with gold, fleets, slaves, and kings who called themselves divine. The great king, Xerxes, wasn't looking to conquer a city. He was looking to swallow all of Greece. And he didn't come alone. Hundreds of thousands of men, cavalry, archers, warships. A storm of steel heading west, dragging half of Asia behind them. Most cities panicked. Some surrendered before the first arrow was knocked. Others debated, bickered, begged for oracles. But Sparta sharpened its spears. They didn't fear death. They feared dishonor. A Persian victory meant tribute, humiliation, slavery. And the Spartans would die before they bowed, but dying had to be organised. The Greek city-states, fractured and competitive, needed a spine, someone to lead them. The Athenians had ships, the Spartans had fear that worked in their favour, and so Sparta led the resistance. But the timing was wrong. Always the gods, the signs, the festivals. Sparta's army couldn't march immediately, not because of cowardice, but because of ritual. The sacred festival of Carnea had begun, and no war could be waged until it ended. So instead of an army, they sent a message. One king, 300 men, Leonidas, not a myth, a real man. A king who understood that holding the pass at Thermopylae wasn't a military strategy. It was a message, a delay, a symbol. The pass was narrow. Mountains squeezed the road into a thin throat, the only path Xerxes' army could take. If it could be blocked, the Persian advance would slow. If it could be held, Greece might unify. So the Spartans stood there. Not just them. Other Greeks joined too. Thespians, Thebans. But it was the 300 Spartans who made the backbone. Veterans, chosen men, not boys from the Agog. Men with sons, so their bloodline would not vanish. They held the pass for 3 days. 3 days of endless waves. Arrows, spears, bronze on bronze. Spartans fought like they trained. Tight formations. No fear, no retreat. They moved like one animal with 300 heads and 600 arms, stabbing and killing in silence, covered in sweat, blood, dirt. They broke charge after charge, killed wave after wave. The Persians, despite their numbers, couldn't break them until betrayal. A Greek named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain trail, a back door. The Spartans were about to be surrounded. Leonidas knew. He dismissed most of the allied troops, told them to run, save themselves. But he and his Spartans stayed. They knew they were going to die. That was the point, and they made it count. Even as the Persian immortals closed in from the rear, the Spartans didn't break. They fought with swords until they snapped, then daggers, then fists, then teeth. They were slaughtered. But the myth was born. Their bodies were found in heaps. Leonidas' corpse was crucified. The Persians tried to erase their defiance. They only succeeded in writing it into legend. Thermopylae wasn't a victory, it was a funeral. But it bought time, because back in the south the Athenians had evacuated their city. Their navy, led by Themistocles, was ready, and at the Battle of Salamis in the narrow straits, the Greek ships trapped and shattered the Persian fleet. Sparta sent soldiers to Plataea, where the Persian land forces were crushed. The tide turned. Xerxes retreated. Greece survived. And the Spartans? They were heroes, but not for long. Victory made Athens bold, powerful, rich. They built an empire draped in democracy and silver coin. Sparta, meanwhile, kept to its ancient ways, suspicious of change, hostile to wealth. The alliance cracked. Resentment grew. Sparta had saved Greece, but it would soon go to war with it. The Peloponnesian War was coming. But for a brief moment at Thermopylae they were exactly what they were born to be. Not men. Symbols. Symbols of duty over life, of silence in the face of death, of a system so brutal, so inhuman, that it created people willing to die, not for glory, not for reward, but because the law said so. And in Sparta the law was the only god that mattered. The Persian threat had been pushed back. Greece was still standing, scarred, singed, but standing. And for a moment there was unity. The great cities had fought side by side, bled together, buried their dead in shared soil. But this is Greece we're talking about. Peace never lasts. Victory did something strange to Athens. It made them ambitious. They had the navy, the money, the trade routes, and now the confidence. They began transforming their defensive alliance, the Delian League, into something very different. Cities that once joined willingly now paid tribute. Those who tried to leave found themselves at the business end of an Athenian trireme. Democracy at home, empire abroad. And while Athens grew richer, flashier, more powerful, Sparta watched. They didn't like what they saw. Sparta had always been different. A closed society, suspicious of change, suspicious of wealth, suspicious of anything that didn't smell like discipline and sweat. Athens represented everything they hated. Debate instead of obedience, theatre instead of training, philosophy instead of silence. And now Athens was more than annoying, it was threatening. Tension simmered, allies complained, border skirmishes flared, and then finally it all exploded. In 431 BCE, Sparta declared war on Athens, not because they wanted land, not because they wanted glory, but because they felt they had no choice. This wasn't a war for conquest, it was a war for dominance, for whose version of Greece would survive. Sparta had the best army, period. Their hoplites were legendary, disciplined, terrifying, brutally efficient. No other city could match their phalanx on open ground. Athens, on the other hand, had the sea. Their navy was the strongest the Greek world had ever seen, and their wealth gave them reach that Sparta couldn't match. So for years, neither side could land a killing blow. Sparta marched into Athenian territory, burned crops, destroyed villages. But Athens simply stayed behind its massive city walls and waited them out. They sent ships around the Peloponnese, raiding Spartan allies, strangling trade routes. It was a slow-motion death match, grinding, attritional, and full of dirty tactics. Then came the plague. In 430 BCE, a disease swept through Athens. Packed tight behind their walls, tens of thousands died. Entire families vanished. Even Pericles, their great leader, succumbed. But Athens didn't break. If anything, they got meaner. The war dragged on, for decades. Sparta tried to trigger revolts. Athens tried to starve Sparta's food supply. Both sides committed atrocities. Cities were razed. Civilians were slaughtered. Alliances shifted, crumbled, reformed. In 415 BCE, Athens made its biggest mistake. They launched an ambitious expedition to Sicily, hoping to conquer the city of Syracuse and expand their empire. But the plan was poorly executed. The Spartans helped the defenders, and what followed was one of the most catastrophic failures in ancient military history. The Athenian fleet was destroyed. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. The survivors were thrown into quarries and left to die of starvation and disease. It was a disaster that shook Athens to its core. Sparta saw its opening. They made a deal with Persia, the same enemy they once fought at Thermopylae. In exchange for gold to build a navy, Sparta promised to hand over Greek cities in Asia Minor. It was betrayal, but it worked. Now Sparta had ships. In 405 BCE, under the command of Lysander, the Spartan navy destroyed the last of Athens' fleet at the Battle of Aegospotami. The city, starved and defenceless, surrendered the following year. After nearly 30 years, the war was over. Athens was broken, its walls torn down, its fleet burned, its democracy dismantled. Sparta was now the master of Greece. But something had changed. They had won, yes, but at what cost? The discipline was still there, the phalanx still marched, but the soul of Sparta had taken on new cracks. They had made deals with enemies. They had ruled cities they barely understood. They had become entangled in the very politics they once refused to touch. Sparta had risen to the top. But they weren't built for empire. They didn't want to manage. They wanted to control. Through fear, through simplicity, through the same brutal order they had always known. And that system, it was starting to rot from the inside. Because conquering a world is one thing. Holding it is something else entirely. They had done it. After centuries of isolation and discipline, after decades of blood and war, Sparta now ruled Greece. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt unstable. Because Sparta was never built to lead an empire. It was built to control itself. Every part of Spartan life had been engineered for one thing: survival through discipline. Not wealth, not expansion, not diplomacy, just control. But now that they were on top, the world expected something else. Administration, trade, foreign policy. The things Athens had thrived at. The things Sparta hated, and it showed. Cities they'd liberated from Athenian control quickly realized the Spartans were worse. They didn't bring freedom. They brought governors, Spartan harmists, who ruled with the same cold iron they used at home. Tribute was still taken, dissent was crushed. Only now it was done with fewer words and more whips. The allies who'd helped Sparta win the war began to turn. Corinth, Thebes, even the old enemies of Athens. None of them liked this new Spartan order. And underneath all that unrest, back home in Laconia, the real danger was growing. The Helots, they'd always been there, the enslaved majority, the ones who worked the land, fed the warriors, raised the crops. For centuries the Spartans had lived in fear of revolt. That's why their system was so strict, so militarized. Because if the Helots ever rose up in force, they'd overwhelm the citizen class in days. Now the Helots were watching their masters stumble. They were hearing whispers from other cities, and they were getting bolder. Meanwhile, Sparta's own population was crumbling. The Agoge still trained boys, but fewer were making it through. Fewer families were even eligible to send their sons. The strict land laws meant that wealth became concentrated. A handful of families owned more and more. The rest, once proud warrior citizens, slipped into poverty, unable to contribute to the army, stripped of status. Sparta had always been an elite club. Now that club was shrinking, fast. By the early 4th century BCE, Sparta's power looked solid from the outside, but on the inside it was hollow. Then came Thebes. They'd been humiliated during the Peloponnesian War, treated like muscle, never trusted, never respected. Now they saw their chance. In 371 BCE, at the Battle of Leuctra, Sparta marched north to put Thebes back in its place. Confident, arrogant. They expected the usual: tight phalanx, quick victory, another warning to anyone who forgot who was in charge. But Thebes had a new weapon: innovation. Their general, Epaminondas, used tactics Sparta had never seen. A staggered line, a deepened flank, targeted attacks on Spartan kings, and more importantly, a new kind of warrior, the Sacred Band. Pairs of lovers fighting side by side, fearless, loyal to each other above all else. The result? A massacre. Sparta lost. Not just the battle, but the myth. For the first time in memory, their army had been broken, not outnumbered, outclassed. The illusion shattered. Greek cities realized Sparta could be beaten, and once the fear was gone, the knives came out. Thebes invaded the Peloponnese. They marched into Spartan territory, freed the Helots, burned villages. The Spartan homeland, untouched for centuries, was desecrated. The backbone of the Spartan system, cheap, forced labour, was ripped out, and with it, everything else began to fall. They tried to adapt. They opened up the Agoge to new classes, tried to build navies, forge alliances, play the same political games they once despised. But it was too late. The world had changed. Sparta hadn't. And for a society that prided itself on not bending, not breaking, not compromising, that was the beginning of the end. Sparta had been broken before, but not like this. This time there was no comeback waiting, no new king with a clever strategy, no rallying cry echoing through the mountains. After Leuctra, the very core of the Spartan machine, its land, its people, its fearsome reputation, was in pieces. The Helots were gone, freed by Theban hands and never coming back, and with them vanished the foundation that had held everything in place. No more free labour, no more time to train every day for war, no more army that could march without worrying about who was planting the crops back home. The citizen numbers dropped even further. Some say that by the 3rd century BCE, there were fewer than 1,000 full Spartan citizens left. Not because they died in battle, but because their own rules strangled them. The inheritance laws, the obsession with purity, the refusal to evolve. You could have 100 men with the spirit of Leonidas, but if none of them own land or marry or produce heirs, the system doesn't care. You're out. Sparta tried reforms. Some kings, like Agis IV and later Cleomenes III, saw the decay and tried to hit the reset button. They wanted to redistribute land, rebuild the citizen body, bring back the old discipline. Some even tried to cancel debts and start over from scratch. But the wealthy elite, the new aristocrats who'd replaced warriors with wine goblets and silk tunics, fought back, literally. Agis was executed. Cleomenes fled to Egypt. Sparta had become something it swore it never would. Soft on the inside, guarded only by memories. And the outside world, it didn't care anymore. Macedon rose to power under Philip and his son, Alexander the Great. And what did Sparta do while Alexander was storming across Persia, defeating armies 10 times the size of his own? They stayed home. They didn't join, didn't resist, didn't help. When Alexander sent messengers offering alliance or tribute, the Spartans reportedly replied with a single sentence. If. It was proud. It was poetic. It was also irrelevant. Sparta had become the guy in the corner of the room who used to be a big deal but now just mutters about how everyone else is doing it wrong. The world had moved on. Hellenistic kingdoms rose. Trade exploded. Ideas flowed. New armies fought with cavalry, archers, siege towers, and Sparta, still marching in straight lines, still training boys to wrestle in the mud, still pretending that hoplites could hold the future back. By the time the Romans came knocking, Sparta wasn't a threat. It was a curiosity. Roman generals visited the city not to fight it, but to study it, to admire it like one might admire a marble statue. Cold, perfect, dead. Even the Romans, with all their love of discipline, didn't copy Sparta's model. They saw the cracks. They saw what happened when you turn strength into religion. When you worship order so much that you choke the very people you claim to protect. And yet, Rome loved the idea of Sparta. They turned it into a symbol. Writers like Plutarch praised Spartan simplicity. They wrote about the Argolgi, about Leonidas, about self-denial and courage and sacrifice. They made Sparta into a kind of myth. Not the real city, because the real city was now mostly dust, but the version they wanted to believe in. Tourists would visit Sparta's ruins. Roman senators would send their sons to learn Spartan values, which usually meant getting yelled at by an old man with one eye and a wooden sword. The modern world remembers Sparta as something fierce and noble, but that's because we remember the Thermopylae, not the centuries that followed. We remember the stories, because the stories are clean. The reality wasn't. Sparta didn't fall in a blaze of glory. It rusted. A society that feared change more than failure, that trained warriors but not thinkers, that forgot how to adapt. And when the world stopped playing by its rules, it was left behind. Still proud, still stubborn, but silent. You'd think that would be the end. A city like Sparta, rigid, insular, built to conquer or die, should have disappeared entirely once it stopped conquering. But no, Sparta didn't vanish. It evolved into something stranger. It became a ghost that haunted history. The city itself limped on, technically inhabited, a shadow of what it had once been. The ruins stood. A few stone roads, a temple here, a wall there. Tourists, first Roman, then Byzantine, then European, walk through it like visitors at a mausoleum, wondering how this pile of rocks had once terrified the world. But Sparta's bones weren't the part that lasted. The myth did. It started with the Romans. They loved a good origin story. And Sparta, with its stern mothers, its silent boys, its men who marched toward death with a grin, was perfect. Roman writers like Plutarch began to twist the stories, clean them up, leave out the brutality, emphasize the honour, the courage, the self-control. They turned Sparta into a kind of philosophical mascot, stoicism with abs. They didn't mention the slaves, or the beatings, or the poverty, or how the entire system collapsed because it couldn't adapt. That would ruin the image. Centuries later, when Europe was searching for its classical roots, Sparta came back into fashion again. Enlightenment thinkers praised Spartan discipline while casually ignoring that the discipline was enforced with blood and fear. Revolutionary France admired the Spartan ideal. So did Imperial Britain. Even Nazi Germany romanticised Spartan eugenics and militarism, a terrifying case of myth turning into political blueprint. Meanwhile, Athens, the actual birthplace of democracy, philosophy, art, was often dismissed as soft, emotional, decadent, because Sparta had the better soundbite. Come back with your shield, or on it. That's the line people remember, not the one about the helots being murdered each year in ritualised secret police missions, not the one about flogging children until they bled in the name of the gods, just the shield, the duty, the glory. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Sparta made another comeback, this time in pop culture, comics, movies, video games, that one film with the screaming king and the slow-motion spears. Suddenly, every gym was selling Spartan workouts, tough mudder races, endurance contests, no pain, no gain, with a Corinthian helmet on the t-shirt. They called themselves warriors. They forgot Sparta wasn't a gym, it was a prison. The Spartans didn't choose suffering because it made them stronger. They suffered because their system left no room for softness, or art, or joy. They were trapped in a culture that told them death was preferable to change. That pain was the only honest currency, but people love symbols, and Sparta is a hell of a symbol. The last stand, the grit, the simplicity, it appeals to something deep, something tribal. In a world full of chaos, the idea of a society that was clear about what mattered, honour, loyalty, sacrifice, feels like clarity, even if it's a lie. The real Sparta is gone, long gone. And honestly, it was never as clean as the stories. It was brutal, paranoid, unsustainable. It created some of the toughest soldiers in history, but at the cost of everything else. No great art, no scientific breakthroughs, no golden age of discovery, just war. That's the legacy. But the myth? That lives, stronger than ever, etched into books, echoed in speeches, printed on gym walls. And maybe that's what Sparta always wanted. Not comfort, not survival, just to be remembered as the hardest place that ever existed. They got their wish. Sparta didn't rise in a vacuum. It wasn't the only city trying to carve itself into stone against the chaos of ancient Greece. It just took a different route. Where others reached for greatness, Sparta clung to survival. Where others opened doors, it slammed them shut. Let's start with the obvious. Athens. If Sparta was the clenched fist, Athens was the open hand. Sparta raised warriors. Athens raised thinkers. The same century that Spartan boys were being whipped in silence, Athenian boys were arguing in the agora, listening to Socrates poke holes in their logic. While Sparta trained phalanxes, Athens built temples. While Spartans marched in rhythm, Athenians wrote plays that asked what it meant to be human. While Spartan mothers told their sons to come back on their shields, Athenian mothers told theirs to come back with stories. And it worked. For a while, Athens bloomed. Article democracy, science, literature, the kind of stuff that fills textbooks today and gets carved into museum walls. But freedom isn't always stable, and Athens crumbled under its own contradictions, slavery, imperialism, internal bickering. The very openness that made it great also made it vulnerable. Sparta saw that and nodded smugly. They thought they'd chosen the better path. Then there was Thebes. Nobody liked Thebes. They were too aggressive for Athens, too clever for Sparta, too ambitious for their size. But when the balance of power shifted, it was Thebes, not Sparta, that invented new tactics. That broke the myth of Spartan invincibility at Leuctra. That freed the helots. Thebes didn't last long either. It rose fast and burned out faster. But for a brief moment, it proved you didn't need to copy Sparta's model to beat Sparta's army. Then there's Corinth, rich, decadent, full of trade ships and scandal. To Spartans, Corinth was everything wrong with the world. Luxury, jewellery, soft men and fast-talking merchants. But Corinth built a different kind of empire. Not through spears, but silver. They made deals instead of enemies. And they lasted a lot longer than they should have. Even Persia had its moment. Yes, the giant enemy at the gates, Yes, the ones who sent waves of soldiers at Thermopylae. But Persia, for all its tyranny, ruled a multicultural, multilingual empire that stretched across continents. It absorbed cities, didn't destroy them. It offered roads and coins and a chance to exist under a different flag. Sparta wouldn't have known what to do with that kind of scale. They couldn't even hold on to their corner of the Peloponnese without the whole thing collapsing. Then, finally, came Rome. Rome took a little from everywhere: Spartan discipline, Athenian ideals, Persian scale. The Roman Republic was built by war, but it was maintained by bureaucracy, law, roads, diplomacy. And when Rome decided to absorb Greece, it didn't even bother to fight Sparta, it just walked past it. Because by then, Sparta wasn't a threat, it was an artifact. Rome outlasted them all, in part because it adapted. Ruthless, yes, but flexible. It could be a sword or a scroll depending on what was needed. That's something Sparta never learned. You can't just be hard, you have to bend or you'll break. That's the thing most civilizations figured out, eventually, not Sparta. They thought compromise was weakness, so they froze in place, even as the world melted around them. And yet, ironically, it's Sparta that many remember most. Not Thebes with its tactical genius, not Corinth with its wealth, not even Persia with its sprawling empire. Sparta, the city that said no to everything but strength, the one that didn't invent anything, didn't write anything, didn't build much that lasted, but made sure somehow that its name did. That's the paradox. The harder they held onto their values, the faster they died. But the harder they died, the longer they lasted in our heads. The Roman Empire wasn't just another rival for Sparta, it was a whole new world. When Rome first started expanding into Greece, Sparta was already a shadow of its former self, clinging stubbornly to ancient traditions that Rome neither understood nor respected. Rome was something different. It was ruthless, sure, but also incredibly practical. Where Sparta lived and died by honour and rigid discipline, Rome lived and thrived by adaptation and expansion. Rome didn't care if you were born a warrior or a merchant. If you could fight or pay taxes, you had a role in the empire. The Spartans looked down on the Romans at first, dismissing them as uncultured upstarts, farmers with ambition and legions, nothing more. But Rome wasn't interested in Sparta's scorn. It was interested in Sparta's land, its location, its people. As the Romans pushed into Greece, Sparta's power faded into insignificance. It had no navy to challenge Rome's fleets, no diplomatic clout to sway allies, no resources to sustain prolonged conflict. The great Spartan warrior culture was built for battle on land, but Rome had mastered war on every front: sea, diplomacy, infrastructure. By the time the Roman Republic turned into the Roman Empire, Sparta was no more than a small town under Roman rule. It had lost its military supremacy, its unique social order, even much of its identity. The once feared hoplites had been replaced by Roman soldiers in shiny armour, marching to new standards under new gods. Yet Rome was fascinated by Sparta. Roman elites admired Spartan discipline, their simple lifestyle, their dedication to duty. Writers like Plutarch wrote biographies of Spartan kings and heroes that became textbooks for Roman youth. The Spartan ideal became part of Roman education, a symbol of strength and austerity in a world growing ever more decadent. Some Roman emperors even styled themselves after Spartan kings, trying to emulate their legendary toughness and honour. But Sparta was a symbol, not a power anymore. The city that had once refused to bow to Persia and crushed enemies on the battlefield was now just a footnote in Roman history. Despite that, the Romans kept Sparta intact, preserving some of its traditions as curiosities, even tourist attractions. Senators and generals would visit to see where Leonidas made his last stand, walking the same streets and imagining a world ruled by discipline and honour. Still, Sparta under Rome was a pale echo of itself. Quiet, obedient, and far from the terrifying warrior city it once was. Rome had conquered the world, but it couldn't conquer Sparta's legend. The spirit of Sparta lived on in Roman stories, in the ideals of Stoic philosophers, in the tales told around campfires across the empire. And when Rome eventually fell, that legend didn't die with it. It was carried forward, preserved by history and myth alike, waiting for the moment it would be reborn again, not as a city, but as an idea. The Roman Empire started small, as a city on the Tiber River, just one of many tiny towns in ancient Italy. But from that modest beginning, Rome grew into the greatest empire the world had ever seen. It wasn't luck. It was a mix of ruthless ambition, brilliant strategy, and a talent for turning enemies into allies. Rome began as a republic, ruled by elected officials and a complex system of checks and balances. It wasn't a democracy like we think of today. Only a small elite got to vote, but it was enough to keep power somewhat balanced. Roman citizens had a voice, and they fought hard to protect it. War was Rome's business. From the very start, Romans trained to fight, not just for survival, but for expansion. Their legions were the most organised and disciplined armies of their time. Unlike other armies, Roman soldiers fought together in units called cohorts, trained to adapt on the battlefield and follow commands instantly. They built roads and forts as they conquered, moving faster and striking harder. The Punic Wars with Carthage marked Rome's rise to dominance in the Mediterranean. Carthage was a wealthy trading empire and the rivalry was fierce. The Second Punic War is famous for Hannibal, the general who marched elephants across the Alps to surprise Rome. But Rome never gave up. It pushed back, defeated Carthage, and eventually destroyed the city entirely. This victory gave Rome control of the Western Mediterranean and opened the door to empire. As Rome expanded, it absorbed many cultures, Greek, Egyptian, Gaulish, and didn't just crush them, but often adopted their gods, customs, and knowledge. This cultural flexibility made the empire stable and resilient. But empire brought new problems. The wealth from conquest fueled corruption, inequality, and political chaos. Powerful generals like Julius Caesar used their armies to grab power, ending the Republic and sparking civil wars. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE led to more chaos, until his adopted heir Augustus emerged as Rome's first emperor. Augustus cleverly kept the illusion of republican rule but held all the real power. Under him, Rome entered the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a 2-century golden age of stability, prosperity, and monumental building projects. Rome's cities grew grander with roads, aqueducts, baths, and arenas. The Colosseum could hold tens of thousands, staging brutal gladiator fights that entertained the masses and demonstrated imperial power. But the empire was vast, stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia, and managing it was a constant challenge. Rome built an extensive network of roads and communication systems, but the sheer size made it vulnerable. The empire faced invasions, internal rebellions, and economic troubles. Emperors came and went, some capable and wise, others brutal and incompetent. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, grew into the dominant religion, changing Rome's identity. In 395 CE, the empire split into East and West. The Western Roman Empire, with its capital in Rome, struggled to hold back invading Germanic tribes. In 476 CE, the last Western emperor was deposed, marking the traditional end of the Roman Empire in the West. But the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman laws, culture, and military traditions until it finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453. Rome's legacy is enormous. Its laws, language, Latin, architecture, and ideas about governance still influence the modern world. Its story is a powerful reminder that even the mightiest can rise, rule, and fall. Long before Rome was an empire, it was a republic, a complicated system where power was shared, but only among the elite. The republic was built on the idea that no single person should hold all the power, so it split authority between two consuls, elected each year, who ruled together. They had to keep each other in check, or at least try to. Then there was the Senate, a body made up mostly of wealthy patricians, Rome's aristocracy. The Senate didn't pass laws like a modern parliament, but it controlled money, foreign policy, and most of the real power behind the scenes. It was a club for Rome's richest families, and membership was the ultimate prize. But not everyone was in this club. The plebeians, commoners, made up most of Rome's population but had little say at first. Over centuries, through strikes, protests and political pressure, they gained rights like electing their own officials called tribunes. Tribunes had the power to veto decisions that hurt the people. It was a slow, tense tug of war between classes that defined Roman politics. This system wasn't perfect. Power struggles were brutal. Patricians and plebeians clashed. Ambitious men exploited the chaos. But the Republic's framework allowed Rome to govern a growing city and then a growing empire without falling apart immediately. War was deeply connected to politics. Military success meant prestige, money and influence. Generals like Marius and Sulla turned armies into personal power bases, marching on Rome itself. This set dangerous precedents. Armies loyal to generals, not the Republic. Then came Julius Caesar, the master of this new kind of politics. A brilliant general and populist leader, Caesar pushed the Republic to its breaking point. His crossing of the Rubicon River in 49 BCE wasn't just a military move, it was a declaration that the old order was dead. After years of civil war, Caesar was assassinated, but the Republic never recovered. His heir, Augustus, cleverly kept the forms of the Republic but ruled as the first emperor, starting the empire and ending the Republic. The Republic was Rome's foundation, a system built on balance, but tested by ambition, war, and inequality. It gave Rome the tools to grow, but those same tools helped bring it down. The Roman military was the engine that drove Rome's rise from a small city-state to a colossal empire. It wasn't just about brute force, it was about organisation, discipline, and innovation. The Roman legions were unlike any army that had come before them. They were a highly trained professional fighting force, and their effectiveness was key to Rome's dominance. Early on, Rome's army was made up of citizen soldiers, farmers, artisans, and landowners, who took up arms during times of war and then returned home. They fought because their land, families, and honour depended on it. But as Rome's territory grew, so did the demand for soldiers. The Republic began to rely on soldiers who were less tied to the land, more loyal to their generals, and eventually professionalised. The backbone of the Roman army was the legion, typically around 5,000 heavily armed infantry soldiers. These legions were divided into smaller groups called centuries and cohorts, each with clear roles and commanders. This modular structure allowed for flexibility on the battlefield. A Roman legion could change formation and tactics quickly, reacting to threats or exploiting weaknesses in enemy lines. Roman soldiers weren't just fighters, they were builders, engineers, and survivors. When they marched, they constructed roads, forts, and bridges, ensuring their supply lines remained intact. This infrastructure wasn't just military, it was political, helping to connect Rome's vast empire and integrate conquered peoples. Tactics played a huge role. The famous Roman formation, the testudo or tortoise, saw soldiers interlocking their shields to form a near-impenetrable shell against arrows and missiles. Roman commanders emphasized discipline. Retreat was rare because it was met with harsh punishment, but the training made Roman soldiers fear less and fight smarter. Rome's military successes were staggering. The Punic Wars against Carthage showcased Rome's ability to adapt. Carthage had a powerful navy, and Rome had none at first, so the Romans built a fleet from scratch, invented boarding bridges called corvi to turn sea battles into infantry fights, and defeated Carthage's experienced sailors. But Rome's enemies weren't just foreign powers. Conquering vast lands meant dealing with rebellions, guerrilla warfare, and hostile tribes like the Gauls, the Germanic tribes, and Parthians. The Roman military had to be both a hammer and a shield, suppressing uprisings, defending borders, and projecting power thousands of miles from the capital. The army also became deeply intertwined with politics. successful generals gained fame, wealth, and political influence, sometimes more than the Senate or consuls. Figures like Marius reformed the army by recruiting landless citizens, offering them pay and pensions, which increased soldiers' loyalty to their generals rather than the republic itself, a change that destabilized the old order. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul demonstrated how military power could translate into political dominance. His legions were fiercely loyal to him personally, and his crossing of the Rubicon was a calculated gamble that turned civil war into a reality. His military prowess made him a dictator, but also a target, leading to his assassination. Under the Empire, the military became even more professional. The legions were stationed across the Empire's borders in forts and camps, acting as both defenders and symbols of Roman power. The Empire's size demanded a massive military presence, with soldiers from all over, Gauls, Spaniards, Germans, even Syrians, fighting under Roman standards. Yet, maintaining such a massive force came at a cost. Recruitment challenges, the expense of pay, and the difficulties of defending vast frontiers put increasing strain on the Empire. Over time, the quality of soldiers declined, and the army became more reliant on mercenaries and barbarian recruits, often with divided loyalties. Still, Rome's military legacy endures. The tactics, discipline, and organization of Roman legions influenced armies for centuries. The roads they built, many still in use today, connected continents. Their battles reshaped the world, setting borders and creating a legacy of power that defined Western civilization. In many ways, the Roman army was more than just soldiers. It was the lifeblood of Rome's ambition, its symbol of order, and the reason why a tiny city could dominate the ancient world for centuries. The Roman Empire was more than just an army conquering lands. It was a complex political and social machine built to govern millions of people spread across 3 continents. Managing this empire required a sophisticated system that balanced power, control, and local autonomy, all while keeping the peace and collecting taxes to fund Rome's ambitions. At the heart of the empire was the emperor, the supreme ruler who held ultimate authority. Starting with Augustus, the emperor was both a political leader and a religious figure, seen as the princeps, or first citizen, and later often worshipped as a god. Emperors wielded immense power, controlling the army, the treasury, and the legal system. Their word was law, but many had to carefully navigate the Senate and Rome's traditions to maintain legitimacy and prevent rebellion. The Senate still existed, but its role changed dramatically under the Empire. Once the powerful centre of the Republic, it became more of an advisory council, a symbol of Rome's past glory rather than a real governing body. Senators often came from noble families and held important positions, but their influence depended heavily on the emperor's favour. Still, the Senate provided a veneer of republican tradition, which helped calm the Roman elite uneasy about the loss of their old power. Rome's vast territories were divided into provinces, each governed by officials appointed by the emperor or the Senate. These governors were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and administering justice. Some provinces were peaceful and wealthy, others were war zones constantly threatened by invasions or rebellion. To keep the empire running, Rome developed a vast bureaucracy. Couriers, tax collectors, engineers, judges, and countless other officials worked to keep communications open and the wheels turning. The Roman road network wasn't just for legions, it was vital for trade, diplomacy, and administration. The famous phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," wasn't just a metaphor, it reflected the reality of Rome's control over its empire. Local elites in conquered regions were often co-opted into Roman systems of power. Rome was pragmatic. Instead of wiping out local traditions, it frequently allowed them to continue as long as loyalty and taxes flowed to the emperor. This approach helped stabilize the empire but created a patchwork of cultures, religions, and customs that sometimes clashed. Roman law was one of the empire's greatest legacies. It created a framework for justice that influenced Western legal systems for centuries. Laws were written, recorded, and applied throughout the empire, providing a sense of order in diverse lands. Concepts like innocent until proven guilty and legal representation owe much to Roman legal traditions. Economically, the empire thrived on agriculture, trade, and slavery. Wealth flowed into Rome from conquered lands. Gold, grain, slaves, and luxury goods fill the city's markets. trade routes connected distant provinces from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Egypt, bringing goods and ideas together. But Rome's vast wealth also brought inequality. The elite lived in grand villas with slaves attending their every need, while the urban poor often struggled in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Bread and circuses, free grain and entertainment were used to keep the masses content and prevent unrest. Religion was another tool of control and unity. Early on, Romans worshipped a pantheon of gods similar to the Greeks, but as the empire expanded, it incorporated new deities and cults. Emperor worship became official, a way to enforce loyalty. Then Christianity emerged, initially persecuted, but eventually embraced and made the state religion under Emperor Constantine, changing the empire's spiritual and cultural fabric forever. However, governing such a sprawling empire wasn't easy. Corruption, slow communication, and vast distances made it difficult to enforce laws uniformly. Provincial governors sometimes acted like kings, exploiting locals. Rebellions flared up regularly, from Jewish revolts to barbarian uprisings. The empire's size was both its strength and its weakness. Defending long borders stretched the military thin. Economic strain increased as the costs of administration and defence grew. The gap between rich and poor widened, fueling social tensions. Political instability plagued the empire, especially in the 3rd century CE, when a rapid succession of emperors, often installed by the army, led to civil wars and chaos, the so-called crisis of the 3rd century. It took reforms from emperors like Diocletian and Constantine to stabilise and reorganise the empire. Diocletian divided the empire into east and west, each with its own emperor to make governing easier. Constantine moved the capital to Byzantium, later called Constantinople, shifting power eastward and setting the stage for the Byzantine Empire. Despite these reforms, the Western Roman Empire continued to weaken, unable to fend off increasing barbarian invasions. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire endured for centuries longer, preserving Roman law and culture even after the fall of Rome. The story of Rome is one of incredible achievement, but also of the challenges that come with ruling a vast and diverse empire. Its political genius, military might, and cultural legacy shaped the course of history, but the pressures of size, wealth, and complexity eventually wore it down. The decline of the Western Roman Empire was not sudden. It was a slow unravelling, a combination of internal weaknesses and external threats that gradually chipped away at what was once the most powerful empire in the world. The causes were complex and intertwined, spanning over centuries, but the effects were devastating. Internally, Rome faced deep political instability. After the crisis of the 3rd century, when dozens of emperors rose and fell in quick succession, often assassinated or overthrown by their own soldiers, the empire struggled to find steady leadership. The authority of the emperor was constantly challenged, and the loyalty of the army became unpredictable. This chaos made it difficult to respond effectively to outside threats or manage internal problems. Economic troubles weighed heavily on Rome. The empire's vast size demanded enormous resources to defend and administer, but the economy was weakening. Heavy taxation drained the wealth of ordinary citizens and small landowners who struggled to survive. Inflation spiraled out of control and Rome's currency lost value. Trade routes became unsafe as barbarian raids increased, disrupting commerce and cutting off vital supplies. Socially, the empire was divided. The rich grew richer, living in luxury, while the poor sank deeper into poverty. Large estates owned by wealthy aristocrats expanded, often worked by tenant farmers or slaves, leading to a decline in the small free farmer class that had once formed the backbone of Roman society and military recruitment. This contributed to the weakening of Rome's traditional social structure. Meanwhile, the empire's military faced tremendous challenges. The legions were no longer composed solely of Roman citizens loyal to Rome. Increasingly, the army relied on mercenaries and barbarian soldiers whose loyalty was often questionable. Some of these groups were Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals and Franks, who had once been Rome's enemies but were now enlisted as allies or federati. Federated troops settled on Roman lands in exchange for military service. But the relationship with these tribes was unstable. Many had no interest in following Roman laws or customs, and as pressure from other barbarian groups pushed them further into Roman territory, conflicts became inevitable. The empire's borders, once secure and well defended, became porous and vulnerable. One of the most significant blows came in 410 CE, when the Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, sacked the city of Rome itself. It was the first time in 800 years that Rome had fallen to a foreign enemy. This shock sent ripples throughout the empire and the world, shaking the belief in Rome's invincibility. Not long after, other barbarian groups took advantage of Rome's weakness. The Vandals crossed into North Africa, cutting off critical grain supplies that fed Rome's population. The Huns, fierce nomadic warriors from Central Asia, pushed Germanic tribes further into Roman lands, causing mass migrations and more conflicts. In 455 CE, the Vandals sacked Rome again, looting the city and further weakening the empire's prestige. By this point, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self, fragmented and struggling to maintain control. The final blow came in 476 CE, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. A teenager with little real power, Odoacer declared himself ruler of Italy and sent the imperial regalia to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, symbolically ending the Western Empire. But this event was more a recognition of reality than a sudden collapse. The empire had been eroding for centuries. Local rulers and barbarian kings controlled much of the territory, while Roman culture, law, and administration lingered in various forms. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive, preserving Roman traditions, law, and military power for nearly 1,000 more years. Constantinople became a new capital of Roman civilization, blending Greek, Roman, and Christian cultures. The fall of the Western Roman Empire marked the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages in Europe. It left a fragmented landscape where new kingdoms, often founded by former barbarian groups, rose from the ruins. The ideas, infrastructure, and legacy of Rome survived, influencing law, religion, art, and governance throughout the medieval world and into modern times. Rome's fall wasn't just the collapse of a political entity. It was the transformation of an ancient world, the reshaping of Europe and the birth of a new era. The story of Rome's decline is a powerful lesson about the challenges of empire, how power can be built and lost, how societies can change, and how history moves forward. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire, known to us today as the Byzantine Empire, carried the torch of Roman civilization for nearly 1,000 more years. Centered around its capital, Constantinople, founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 CE on the site of ancient Byzantium, this empire was a remarkable blend of Roman governance, Greek culture, and Christian faith. It was both a continuation of Rome and something uniquely its own. The Byzantine Empire was built on the foundations of Roman law, administration, and military tradition, but it evolved to meet the realities of a changing world. The city of Constantinople was a marvel, protected by massive walls, strategically located for trade between Europe and Asia, and adorned with impressive architecture like the Hagia Sophia, a symbol of the empire's wealth and religious devotion. Politically, Byzantine emperors wielded absolute power, combining secular leadership with spiritual authority. They saw themselves as God's representatives on earth, guardians of Christian orthodoxy and heirs to Rome's imperial legacy. This divine right to rule helped legitimize their authority, but also made court politics and intrigue intense, with palace conspiracies and power struggles common. One of the empire's greatest contributions was its legal code. Emperor Justinian I, who ruled in the 6th century CE, undertook an ambitious project to codify Roman laws into what became known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, or Justinian Code. This legal masterpiece streamlined centuries of Roman legislation and became the foundation for many modern legal systems in Europe.
18-year-old Julian Hernandez was an ambitious young man. He was a senior in high school, excelling academically with a plethora of extracurricular activities under his belt. With aspirations of continuing his education, his future looked brighter than ever as he sat down at his computer and applied to several prestigious colleges. However, when all of his applications were denied due to discrepancies between his name and social security number, Julian was bewildered. Anxious to resolve the matter, he sought the advice of his guidance counselor, hoping to find the source of the problem and resubmit his applications before it was too late. Little did he know, their efforts would unveil a past shrouded in darkness, one that would shake the foundations of Julian's life forever. After researching further into his history, they discovered that Julian had been reported missing 15 years ago. It turns out that all this time, he'd been living under a false identity in blissful ignorance of a tragedy that befell him long ago. Determined to get to the bottom of this discovery, he later confronted his father, Bobby Hernandez, about his findings. Bobby fumbled his words as he desperately tried to elude his son's unrelenting questions, but ultimately gave in and confessed the horrible truth. Julian, feeling lost, confused, and unsure of what to do, later took to Reddit, sharing his bizarre story and asking people for legal advice. On the website, he talked about how his father had changed both their names and social security numbers, erasing their past in order to evade the law. He described how Julian's entire sense of self had been shattered and put back together again as he discovered who he really was, and how this revelation only came to be because his dad couldn't provide tax info when Julian applied for college. He even mentioned how he recalled his father asking him if he still loved him, were he to learn about something terrible he'd done. Apart from being desperate for legal advice, Julian also worried about his academic prospects, since all the straight A's and impressive ACT scores he'd achieved over the past 3 years would be for nothing if his records weren't fixed in time to reapply for scholarships. But first and foremost, he made it explicitly clear that he didn't hold a grudge against his dad for what he did. To Julian, his father had done everything he could for him growing up, and he wanted to know if there was anything that could be done to keep Bobby out of trouble, not just for his sake, but for the sake of Julian's little sister, so that his father would stay out of prison and be there to look after her. But the real question is, why would Bobby Hernandez, Julian's father, kidnap his own son? It all began in 2002, when Bobby and Julian's mother were embroiled in a fierce legal battle over custody of Julian. Bobby's wife eventually won, and the court awarded her full custody of 5-year-old Julian. One day, Bobby asked his former wife whether or not he could babysit Julian after kindergarten. She gullibly agreed, but when she eventually returned home, Julian and Bobby were nowhere to be seen. All that was left was a note from Bobby telling her how he intended to take Julian away for good. Hernandez had fled with Julian to Cleveland, Ohio. There, Bobby found himself a new home with his girlfriend and her children. For 13 long years, they lived as a family. After Julian came of age, he'd often asked his father what became of his mother. Bobby would reply that his mother was gone forever. As for Julian's Reddit plea, it had created an uproar among the online community. Many commented that even though Julian obviously wanted to look out for his old man, he should keep in mind there are usually 2 sides to every story, and his father may be far from the saint he perceived him to be. According to Bobby, he wanted nothing more than to be with his son, and so he took Julian away. But Julian's mom believed Bobby was just bitter, and his taking of Julian was meant to punish her for leaving him. Either way, it's hard to argue that kidnapping one's own child, depriving him of a mother's love, and making him believe his mother abandoned him, is justifiable. Later on, when Julian's school counselor informed the police, and Julian's mother received news that her son had possibly been found, her heart leapt with joy. Yet she remained wary of false hopes, as countless times in the past, similar reported sightings of Julian had been proven to be untrue. But when the police confirmed with certainty it was indeed Julian, she was overwhelmed with emotion and relief. As for Bobby, he was arrested on November 2015. Ultimately, with its unusual and complicated circumstances, the trial of Bobby Hernandez captured the attention of media outlets the world over. The fact that the victim in question was no longer a minor, suffered no abuse, and stood firmly at his abductor's side, pleading with the jury to forgive his father for what he did, made it quite the challenge to prosecute. But after a lengthy court process, the jury ultimately found Bobby guilty of abduction, custodial interference, and forgery of documents, sentencing him to 4 years in prison followed by 5 years of supervised release. As for Julian's mother, despite the passage of time, she never wavered in her faith that her son would one day return to her. For many years, she tirelessly searched near and far for any clues to his whereabouts, but time and again, her efforts were fruitless. Even so, she never lost hope that one day they would be reunited. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. Following the discovery, she was reunited with Julian over the holidays, where the two shared a heartfelt and tearful reunion. In 1976, in the picturesque town of Haina, Hawaii, it seemed as though Mark Barnes, a Vietnam War veteran from California, had it all. He was living in paradise with his girlfriend, Charlotte Moriarty, and their 6-month-old son, Marks. Mark was tending to his garden one sunny day when Charlotte casually mentioned she was going out for a walk. Little did Mark know it would be the last time he saw his girlfriend or his beloved son ever again. He searched for them desperately, but no matter how hard he looked, they were nowhere to be found. 3 weeks later, Mark reported them missing. Despite the desperate search for his missing family lasting 2 long, agonizing years, endlessly scouring the streets and hotels for any signs or news of their whereabouts, all his efforts proved to be in vain, and he began to wonder if he'd ever lay eyes on his beloved family again. Stephen Carter Jr. was born on the Hawaiian Islands with a mysterious past, a feeling he could never quite shake. Born Tenzin Amaya on January 16, 1977, all he knew was that he had been adopted at 4 years old. He was overcome with questions that mercilessly plagued him day after day. Who were his real parents? Why had they given him up? It looked as if those questions would go unanswered, until one day, something changed everything. It was just another ordinary workday at his sales job in Philadelphia. As he scrolled through the latest news stories on his phone during lunch break, a peculiar headline caught his attention. It told the incredible story of Carlina White, a story that was about to change Stephen's life forever. As an infant, Carlina had been taken from a medical facility by a woman dressed in nursing attire. She was only 19 days old. She grew up believing her kidnapper was her biological mother, completely unaware that she was on the missing persons list. But decades later, with the help of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children website, Carlina managed to solve her own case. Stephen had always been told he'd been abandoned as a baby and sent to an orphanage. He could barely remember anything from those days, but he did recall deeply longing for someone to care for him. Then one day, after years of yearning, his dream came true. In 1980, Steve Carter Sr. and his wife had been planning to bring a new addition to their family. Steve was an Army officer stationed in Hawaii, and the couple decided to visit an orphanage. As soon as they laid eyes on 3-year-old Tenzin Amaya, they knew he was the one. They were told by staff that Tenzin was half native Hawaiian, despite having golden blonde hair, bleach-pale skin, and dark blue eyes. The Carters never thought much of it. They gave the young boy a whole new identity, renaming him Stephen Carter Jr. after his adoptive father. Stephen's life drastically changed for the better soon afterward. He and his new family moved to New Jersey, settling in a well-off upscale area called Medford Lakes. Growing up, even though he never wanted for anything, Stephen would still occasionally be haunted by his bewildering past. It certainly didn't help that the date on his birth certificate had been issued a month after he'd actually been born. Yet the ever-curious Stephen never expected his past to catch up with him. His adoptive parents had always been open about his adoption, celebrating Stephen's birthday in their own special way, calling it the day our boy came to be. But as he grew older, questions arose that the Carters couldn't answer. All they really knew was that his biological father was Hawaiian. Stephen grew up and became a college graduate, but the questions he'd harbored since childhood still lingered in the back of his mind. Now, in his 30s, the answers he sought would finally be revealed, and it all began with a simple DNA test kit, gifted to him on Christmas. The results confirmed he had a Scandinavian heritage, which explained his complexion. But most puzzling of all, there was zero trace of Hawaiian ancestry. It was later that he stumbled across the news piece about Carlina White. He was astonished and, at the same time, filled with dread that perhaps his own story could be something similar. Yet he didn't have the courage to find out, at least not right away. But eventually, curiosity got the better of him. With quivering hands and a pounding heart, he looked through the database of missing persons on missingkids.com, and what he saw made his stomach churn. First, he tried looking up his original birth name, Tenzin Amaya, but no records with that name existed. After punching in his real birth date, however, a name came up, Marks Panama Barnes. In July of 1977, Marks was reported missing in Haina, but it was an artist's rendition of Marks, what he'd look like 30 years later, that cast away any doubt in Stephen's mind. The picture resembled him so much, it was almost as if he were looking in a mirror. Everyone around him, his friends, his family, were astonished by the resemblance. Yet Stephen refused to believe any of it. That's when his wife stepped in, urging him to follow through and put all mystery to rest. But even if he arrived at the truth's door, did he have the courage to knock? Stephen felt a turmoil of conflicting emotions. It wasn't too late to turn back now, he thought. He could go on as if nothing had happened and remain in a state of blissful ignorance. But he'd already made up his mind. He had to know. The Honolulu Police Department wasn't sure what to expect when they received a call from Stephen. After all, Marks's case had been open for 3 decades, and the chances of solving a case this old are usually slim to none. Only a DNA test could uncover the truth. 8 months later, the results finally came in, and Stephen's worldview, his identity, was shattered. His suspicions were proven right. His real name was Marks Panama Barnes. The day he went missing, Charlotte, his birth mother, had been wandering aimlessly for some time when she was caught trespassing on private property. After being questioned by authorities, she claimed her name was Jane Amaya. When asked about her son, Charlotte said his name was Teenan, and that his father was a native Hawaiian. She even lied about his birth date. Charlotte was admitted into a psychiatric ward. As for 6-month-old Tenzin, he was taken away from her and sent to an orphanage less than 30 miles from where he'd lived. When Charlotte got out of the hospital, she never came looking for her son, and simply vanished into thin air. Marks's case would have never been solved had it not been for one key player, his half-sister. It turns out Charlotte Moriarty had a daughter named Jennifer Monheimer. Jennifer was 8 years her brother's senior, and had been living in New Mexico with her father when her brother and mother disappeared. When she learned of what happened, Jennifer was beyond traumatized, and determined to get to the bottom of it. In 2001, she flew to Hawaii and pleaded with police officers to reopen her brother's case. The police department then had a sketch artist illustrate what Stephen might look like as an adult. That would be the same picture Stephen would come across 10 years later. The case was finally solved, by its own victim, no less. Stephen Carter Jr. had solved one of the longest missing persons cases in American history, but his story still needed closure. After the dust storm of media attention finally settled, Stephen was ready to reunite with his biological family. It started off by getting in touch with his half-sister Jennifer. Upon hearing from him, she was overwhelmed with emotion and relieved to have answers regarding her brother's whereabouts. Then Stephen reached out to his father, Mark, who was just ecstatic to finally get to meet his long-lost son. As for his biological mother, it remains unclear what happened to Charlotte the day Marks was taken. She was never seen nor heard from ever again. William Bates. Just hours before his mysterious disappearance on August 30th, 1902, Dr. William Horatio Bates, a well-renowned and wealthy ophthalmologist in the heart of New York City, penned a hastily written letter. It was entrusted to his absent wife, Seaman Bates, who was away visiting her mother. Intriguingly, the letter disclosed that he'd been summoned to a distant location alongside an old pupil of his to perform a series of surgical procedures, without stating the duration of his absence. The doctor's palpable excitement regarding the compensation he anticipated for his work was bizarre. After all, why would a man of considerable fortune exhibit such fervor for financial gain? And what could possibly necessitate such urgency that he would abruptly depart without saying goodbye to his wife? The enigma only deepens as we recount that after dispatching the letter, the doctor inexplicably vanished into thin air, neither sending any more letters nor returning home. Before his disappearance, Bates was at the pinnacle of his medical career. He not only possessed good looks, but also wealth, prestige, and the sought-after expertise of a skilled physician. Renowned for his uncanny medical insights, he was frequently sought after by colleagues looking for guidance on unusual cases. Armed with prestigious degrees from Cornell University and the College of Physicians and Surgeons, he had also served as an attending physician at esteemed institutions such as the New York Eye Infirmary and Bellevue Hospital. According to the intriguing allure, he dedicated 5 years to teaching ophthalmology at the reputable New York Postgraduate Medical School and Hospital. Clearly, he was not your average professional. His credentials commanded both respect and admiration. It didn't make sense for someone of such caliber and remarkable accomplishments to simply vanish. When he failed to resurface several days later, Mrs. Bates embarked on a desperate quest. She tirelessly reached out to acquaintances across the United States and Europe in search of any clues. William Bates was known to be an esteemed member of the Masonic Society, so she sought the aid of the local Masonic community. William's picture was distributed far and wide. Finally, a letter arrived from Britain. It spoke of a man bearing an uncanny resemblance to the missing doctor, who had somehow found himself working as a medical assistant at the Charing Cross Hospital in London, after initially being admitted there as a patient. Rumors circulated that when he first arrived at the hospital, he was emaciated with hollowed eyes and was almost on the brink of starvation. This didn't make any sense to Mrs. Bates, as she knew her husband had ample resources stashed away in his bank account, more than enough to live a life of luxury in the grand city. Without hesitation, Mrs. Bates boarded the next ship for London, eagerly anticipating a joyful reunion with her loving husband. But her hopes were shattered as soon as she stood before him. William was a stranger in his own skin, unable to recall their shared life. "I don't know why you bothered, madam," he uttered. "We are strangers." His words pierced through her heart. Reluctantly, the doctor agreed to accompany Mrs. Bates to a hotel, in hopes she could help him recover his memory there. He faintly recalled his hasty departure from New York, summoned aboard a ship to perform a life-altering operation on someone battling a treacherous brain abscess. Hope mingled with confusion as Mrs. Bates resolved to remain in London by her husband's side, desperate for fragments of their past to resurface within his memory. However, her heart was shattered once more when, after just 2 fleeting days together, Bates ran away. This time, Mrs. Bates would never lay eyes on him again. After having been abandoned once more, Mrs. Bates embarked on an exhaustive quest, tirelessly scouring Europe and the east coast of America in search of her husband. But her efforts proved fruitless, and her relentless pursuit tragically ended in 1907 with her life slipping away as she cuddled a cherished portrait of her dearly beloved. 3 years later, Dr. J. Kelly, a close friend of Dr. Bates from their New York days, found himself passing through Grand Forks, North Dakota. It was there that Kelly recognized his